All right, this is part 2 of leveraging EdgeForge to build your immutable operating system images for all of your Edge deployments. So in the previous video, we went through sort of the EdgeForge process, how to create and clone the repo, how to create the files, and then how to create the artifacts. So all of those artifacts are done creating. Now I am stuck or left with this output of from my build process, and this output really just kind of tells you what to do. You need to paste the contents below into your profile. So we have created all the artifacts. I'm going to go ahead and copy this right here just to save it in my clipboard. And then I'll do Docker images just to show you. We've created all the artifacts, all the different versions of Kubernetes that we support. And as well as we have this installation image, this ISO, which is right here. So I have these two installation images. Now, what the next steps are is we need to create a profile and we need to flash our node. So let's go ahead and create the profile first. Actually, let's go ahead and, let me download this image so I can burn it. So I'm going to go ahead and download this to my local drive. This is off from my build server. One of the things that we require is that your build server right now be on AMD 64 based hardware. So this is on just a virtual machine in my lab. So I'm going to download this ISO to my local machine, which will make it easier for me to flash to USB. And then the second thing is we need to go ahead and create our profile. So I'm going to go into my Palette instance that we were in before. Remember, we had our registration token. I'm going to go back to my project called demo, and I'm going to select profiles. Now inside of here, I'm going to add a new cluster profile. We'll call this demo, and we'll set the version. Let's deploy Kubernetes version 1.28.2, and I'm just calling it this. It could be any anything really, but I'm just putting it in here for my reference. This is going to be a full type of profile. We have full infrastructure and add-on. Full just means that I'm going to be provisioning all the infrastructure components, and I could add add-on layers too if I wanted to. So I'll select next. This is called Edge Native. So this is our Edge Native architecture that we're deploying. You can see the other clouds and infrastructure types that we support, but we'll select Edge Native here. And then I've got to select my pack. So what I need to do is take a look in my Palette, let's say public registry, public repo. We have this BYOS layer. Now remember, we copied the contents of my output to my clipboard. So I'm just going to select everything in here and paste. And all that really does is paste in my elements of the output that were given to me, which consists of like where's my registry and what's repo name, stuff like that. And so I put that in here. I'm going to select next layer. The next layer we want to do is Kubernetes. Now we selected K3S before, so we'll select K3S here. And 128.2 just happens to be what's popped up. I'm going to take a look at the pack values. There's things in here I could customize all of these elements if I needed to. But I'm not going to at this time. We could, take a look and see, but you could really, tweak this to your liking. But the defaults generally are useful for most use cases. So I'll select next, and then I want to leverage Cilium. So Cilium here, and again, as with my previous pack layer, I can modify or change things here to my liking, but I'm not going to need to. The defaults are pretty good here. So I'll hit confirm. We've got our 3 layers. We could add an additional layer of, say, a storage. So let's just say we wanted to add a storage layer. We want to add like Longhorn as an example. I can select Longhorn. Again, the defaults are here. They're good. We could modify this if we had some reason to, but the defaults are good. So I'll just go ahead and hit confirm. We have our 4 layers. As I mentioned, you can add other add-ons, things like ingress and load balancing, but for the purposes of this, we're not going to. I'm just going to do this. So I'll select next, and everything looks good. We are good with our profile. So I should be done downloading here. So what I'm going to do next is launch a tool called Balena Etcher. And I plugged in a USB into my computer. So I'm going to flash from file, and we're just going to select that Edge installer that we had before, I'm going to select my target as this flash drive, and then we'll just, flash this device. Now this will take a few minutes, provided I provide the right password. This will take a few minutes while it does the flashing. Essentially, if we just kind of go back to our drawing that we discussed in the first episode, which focused on the kind of flow of how things are, we're at this stage over here. So we're flashing this device at a store, and once the device is flashed, we can then quote ship it to some other location, plug it in, it gets DHCP, or you can statically define an address, and then from there it automatically registers and we can build a cluster from that. But we're at this stage over here. I wanted to kind of highlight a couple of things while we were waiting for this to finish flashing, and one of those things is really focused on why is this such a challenge? And I mentioned before, imagine you have 3 locations. You've got 3 locations that are your edge locations and a couple of stores, and you don't have technicians there, but you have a technician that can make it, and this doesn't really seem like that much of a problem. Let me go ahead and eject this. This doesn't really seem like much of a problem, right? It doesn't seem like a big issue, but when you amplify the number of locations and you have multiples now, and you go, okay, well, I'd have to hire more technicians potentially to support these if I had to send them out there to do any kind of maintenance or any kind of installation. That's just more smart hands. It's more people that are needed. And also you start to get to the realm of what happens when something changes at one of those stores. How do I maintain consistency and those kinds of things? And then it just gets even worse when you add more stores and more stores and more stores. And so really our aim is to make it where when you're building, you're able to use this repeatable process of building an image like we did in the previous video, taking that image and flashing it onto a device like we're going to be doing here, and then consistently deploying that device at many locations with a Kubernetes cluster. So I have with me over here an Intel NUC. I'm gonna go ahead and switch to that and plug in my USB and hit power. Now this should pop up and go through the traditional loading screen that you would see, Intel NUC, and the installation has triggered automatically and said, hey, I want to do an installation. If you wanted to do some troubleshooting, you go into manual, but we're just going to let it go through the installation process, and this process takes, as I mentioned, a couple of minutes, but really what it's doing is it's taking that installation ISO that we had, it's laying it down as the operating system for this device. It's taking those customizations in that user data file, so that was really the, remember I told it to power off as an example. It's partitioning out the drives, and we can talk about drive partitions when we kick off the cluster build. What does that partition look like? But really, it's building out that immutability and providing both the immutable state file, or the immutable root file system, while also providing a volume that is persistent, a volume that you can store data to. You can use Longhorn, you can use other CSIs or other elements that you may need to have persistence kept across reboots and upgrades. It's doing all of those and laying it down and building that out for us. And you can see it's basically done at this point. So it'll take a moment for it'll power off. Once it powers off, you can just essentially just restart it and it'll come up, and we'll be able to go from there. So let me just real quick, I'll wait. I'm going to grab a, let me power this off. Oh, it's powering up, I'm sorry. Should take just a moment. While that's powering off, I'm gonna flip back to there it goes, it powered off. I'm just unplugging the USB, setting it aside, and I'm just gonna power it back on. So we'll power it back on, we'll watch this screen. At the same time, I have my cluster's edge host screen up on my environment, so I can see when this host registers. You can see it goes through the grub menu. The grub menu here is registration because we wanted to call out and tell our Palette SaaS environment, hey, I'm here. I'm a node that you can use to deploy a Kubernetes cluster. So as I mentioned, this process takes just a moment. You'll see some things come through. It's actually quite fast in terms of just the overall process of building a device and flashing, but there we are, we're registered, up and running. You can see it says the Palette endpoint is api.spectrocloud.com. That's good. Our IP address. We got an IP address from DHCP. In this case, I could have specified static address as I mentioned. And then it has a name, and that name is a unique identifier that's used for being able to, if you want to manually register this device inside of Palette. So we have auto registration by default, as I talked about that workflow that we just went through. It has auto registration by default. You may want to disable that in some use cases. So think of a time where you scan a barcode on a box and ship that box. You take that barcode, which is the serial number. You want to use the serial number. You can change this name to be something else other than the UUID. But in this case, we're just defaulting to the UUID. So while that's up, I'm going to flip back to my screen of Palette, and we should see in just a few minutes that device register to our project demo. And from that point forward, we can build our Kubernetes cluster. So there it is. It gives some information about it. It has 16 cores. I said it's Intel NUC. So it's 8 cores, hyper-threaded, 64 gigs of memory, some basic information, MAC address, stuff like that. And if I drill into this a little bit, you can see a little bit more in terms of, what types of disks are there. And we'll talk about disks a bit when I build the cluster. But we have partitioned out. I have 2 drives. In this case, it's just deployed onto an NVMe drive. All right, so next step is really building a cluster. So how do we do that? It's very simple. We just go to our cluster screen. We say add new cluster. We're going to deploy a new cluster. In this case, the type is edge native, just like the profile we built earlier. I can provide it as a demo-01 or something. Give it a description, some tags if I want to. We only have one profile that matches the infrastructure type of edge native, so that's what we're getting here. We'll just select that. I'll click next. You've got your profile that's leveled here. I could add add-ons, like I could add this Nginx add-on if I wanted to or something, but I'm not going to right now. And I could also make cluster-specific manipulations if I want to some of these values, maybe something like the CIDR I need to be different or something. I could change this on a cluster-by-cluster basis. You can also disable that based on roles-based access controls, but I have administrative rights, so I can do this all over. I'll click next. I can add additional SSH keys or NTP servers. I'll just use the default for Ubuntu and those things. We have a ability to do some overlay. I won't talk too much about this other than just to say this is really valuable in areas where DHCP is common and you can't assign a static address because this gives us the ability to maintain a Kubernetes cluster despite physical address changes, like in the case of a node resets or power outage or something, the node comes back up and gets a new DHCP address. This will take care of that. We'll talk about that in a later episode. All right, so I do have to provide a virtual IP address. So as I mentioned before, I'm just going to go ahead and give it something that I know on my network that's available. So we'll just give it 10.100.101. Let's call it 26. This is a virtual IP that's used for high availability. I know this is a single node device, but if I had multiple nodes, I'd want that API server address to be available across all of them. This essentially programs kubevip to be able to enable that floating IP. I'll click next. Lastly, I just need to select what nodes I want to be part of this. So I only have one node pool because I only have one node. So I'm just going to select the edge host that we have down here. I could, at this point, give it a host name, provide static IP information if I wanted to. I'm not going to, but I could. And so that would be, from there. And I want this to allow worker capabilities. I want this control plane node to be able to take workload. We'll click next. There's additional attributes that I can fill out, things like, RBAC and scans and stuff. And we'll talk about those in depth later. But for now, let's just go ahead and validate and start the build process of this server. So I'll click finish. I'm going to go ahead and let this sit here. This will take approximately, 5 to 7 minutes, depending on network connectivity and stuff. But once we are back, we'll have everything ready to go. So I'll see you in just a few minutes. All right, so we're back. You can see the cluster is running. It's going through its last checks. Says unhealthy, but that's just as it's going through its final checks, making sure all of the layers are provisioned and configured in the manner that we want them to be. Additionally, I made a mistake earlier, and in my when I did the deployment, I forgot to push the Docker image. So we're we built this image, but I didn't push it. So I was getting some initial errors. It took a little bit longer than it should have. It took about 10 minutes to deploy this as opposed to the 5 or 7 I had mentioned. But we can go through and see that here's our Edge host. Let me go to our events tab. We can see all of the events that are located here. This is the cluster events, so that means our agent in the cluster is reporting back successfully. If I click on the host itself, I can see the host events, and as I mentioned, it's all desired state. So as the state becomes, as it reaches its desired state, these errors and events will time out. But this is that section where I noticed that failed to do this upgrade image, failed to extract the image, and I realized then that I had not push the Docker image to my registry. So that's an important step that I failed to mention, but push it to your registry and then you have your images available to be downloaded and installed. And let's see if we go back to our cluster. Starting to get job complete. Things are starting to come back online. I'm just waiting for it to go healthy. It shouldn't be too much longer. Additionally, while this is happening, you can see we get a brief overview of any of the events that are relevant. We also can see that our layers are starting to come online, so they're green and healthy. Just as I said, the cluster itself, it has to go through some upgrades because we use the system upgrade controller to apply any patches or changes, and so it's going through and doing that. While this is happening, we can get a view of that profile that we've deployed. We can get a view of the workloads that are on here, although this is probably not very much information right now, simply because it's not been up very long. You can see that this Cilium operator is in a pending state. One of the things about the Cilium pack is that it is asking for 2 replicas on 2 different nodes, and since I only have a single node cluster in this environment, this is expected. But everything else should be largely deployed, and you can get information based on that. Let's see if we click on our nodes there, we see the nodes running. That agent on it has to restart because it will download an update to the latest version, so this will turn healthy once that happens. We should be able to download, here's the kubeconfig file, so I can change to my CLI again. Let me just grab this. And we'll switch our context to be that admin demo. Let's see what we have. So here's our pods. All of them are running, as I mentioned, with the exception of this Cilium operator pod. So that is a brief deployment of a Kubernetes cluster at the edge. This is on an Intel NUC, but really we're hardware agnostic. As we kind of walk through in the first part, how do you build your operating system? We chose Ubuntu. You could choose other OSs. In this part, we went through the actual cluster deployment. How do you build a profile? Make sure you upload your images. I would encourage you to check out our docs, check out our YouTube channel. I'll put some links in the show notes for some of this information. And as always, you can reach out to us on Twitter or follow us on YouTube. And look forward to seeing you in the next video.